Hello and welcome to the module on Introduction to Quantitative Analysis. In this module, we'll be discussing comparisons and relationships in the way of t-tests, correlations, ANOVAs, and chi-squares. And just so you know, this is a really light introduction. We're not getting into formulas or calculations yet. It's really just a discussion on when to use these different kinds of analyses. So first are t-tests, and here we're asking if there is a statistically significant difference between two groups. And there are really three different kinds of ways or reasons that you would use a t-test. So the first one is a treatment and control group, and this one is called an independent samples t-test. This is where you're really comparing the scores or means outcomes for two different groups that are not related to each other at all, hence the name independent samples t-test. The pre and post t-tests, which we would often find in educational studies, a pre and post exam score, right, changes between a first score, we do some type of intervention, or we learn something new, and then we have a post score. That is a paired sample t-test because you're talking about the same group of students, right? It's the same group with the pre and post test. And then we have a test that has just one sample, and this is a test between the sample that you are interested in and whether or not they're significantly different from a known number. For example, does your classroom vary significantly from the national average on something like that? So with t-tests, we must have a continuous variable. Again, a really easy example in education research is an exam score, right? Usually it's 0 to 10, 0 to 100. Some even have a floor, maybe it's 10 to 100, something like that. But exam scores are a really easy way to learn to understand when to use t-tests. And these are measured in means. So again, we're comparing the average score for group 1 against the average score for group 2, or the average score for our sample against the average score for the nation, that kind of example. So here's an example that we can work with to go through some of these different types of t-tests, is how do students' exam scores compare once we have introduced a new diversity, equity, and inclusion reading program. So that's our main question. But we can't actually answer that yet because we don't know what our students' exam scores compare to, right? We just discussed the three main scenarios in which we would use a t-test, but the way that the question is worded right now, we don't actually have that answer. So let's think about it again. How do students' exam scores compare with the new diversity, equity, inclusion reading program? Are we comparing the same group of students who use the old curriculum and the new curriculum? So that would be a paired sample. Are we comparing two groups of students, one who used the old curriculum and one who used the new? That would be an independent samples t-test. Or are we comparing one group, maybe your classroom, against a national average of where both groups used the new reading program? So if we are to reword the question to how do first and second term exam scores compare when the new diversity, equity, and inclusion reading program was introduced in the second term, we're comparing the same students because again, we were thinking about that pre and post test, that first and second term exam scores, right? So it's the same group of students with two time periods. And so we would use the paired samples t-test. How about if we rephrase the question to be, how do exam scores compare between two classrooms, one class using the new curriculum and one class that used the old curriculum? So here, again, you should see two different groups. They are independent of each other, the two classrooms. So here we're using an independent samples t-test. And then what if we were to ask, how do exam scores compare when using the new diversity, equity, and inclusion reading program to the national average reading score? Again, here we're comparing one group of students to a known number, the national average. And so this would be the one sample t-test. In general, when you have calculated a t-score, a large t-score indicates a significant difference between groups, and the small t-score indicates similarities between groups or a lack of significant difference. So once you have your t-score, you can see if there is a significant difference, which group has the higher average, and that score on average or that group on average scored significantly higher than students in the other group. So that's how you can think about those findings. So next we'll talk about correlations. Correlations show the relationships between one variable and another variable. And in the case of the figure here, we are looking at the x variable that is on that horizontal axis and the y variable that goes up and down on the vertical axis. And another way of saying this is, to what extent do two variables change together at a constant rate? So that image number one, you can see that the dots or the circles in the graph are generally going from the bottom left to the upper right. That would be a pretty tight positive correlation, because as the x variable increases, the y variable also increases. That image number two in the middle, it has the same direction, but you can see that the dots or circles are spread more broadly. You can still see the direction. It generally goes from the bottom left to the upper right, but they are not as tightly clustered. So that is a positive correlation, but just not as strong. And then on the far right, image number three, we see that the dots are scattered all over the plot. So this would be really no correlation. The correlation does not exist in this relationship. There is no correlation between the x and y variable. They do not increase at the same rate. They do not decrease at the same rate. So if we have a positive correlation, it indicates a positive relationship. When x increases, y increases. And you might say, well, I just said that, but it's important to also note that you can have a positive correlation, but x and y can decrease at the same rate. So it's still a positive relationship when, or a positive correlation when both variables increase or decrease together. The negative correlation is when one variable increases while the other decreases. So I added this second image here because we didn't have an image on the last slide to depict a negative correlation. So that's that one in the middle, the negative correlation. You can see the x variable is very high, and as the x variable increases, the y variable decreases. And then again, we have that zero correlation. This is just another way of showing it. You can see that line, and these dots are clustered a little more closely to the line. But again, there's no relationship between x and y. You can have a high value of y and a high value of x, a low value of y, and a low value of x, and there's really no rhyme or reason to that relationship, so it's a zero correlation. When you are looking at the calculations and the numerical results for correlations, you will see that they range in value from -1 to 0, or from 0 to +1. So again, a zero correlation, your correlation coefficient would be very close to 0. A positive correlation that is nearly a 1-for-1 change would again be a correlation coefficient very close to 1. We call that very highly correlated. And if there is a negative relationship, but very highly negatively correlated, that would be very close to -1. Next, we'll move on to ANOVA, or analysis of variance. So you will use an ANOVA to determine significant differences across more than two group means. So t-tests, we were using that when we had just two groups, but ANOVAs you can use for when you have more than two groups. A one-way ANOVA has one independent variable with two or more levels. So I have a couple examples here. We want to compare mean scores across 3 classrooms. So it's the classroom that has more than 2 levels, right? There are 3 classrooms, that's 3 levels. We want to compare the average time it takes to complete homework across 4 different high school AP courses, right? So we have 4 AP courses or AP subjects that has the 4 levels. And so we compare average time of homework really across 4 different groups. So we're doing multiple comparisons there. And the ANOVA tells you if there is a difference between groups, but it does not indicate which groups are actually different. So you could have the AP course 1 be significantly different from AP Course 2 in terms of time it takes to complete the homework, but you might have AP Course 1 take roughly the same amount of time to complete the homework as it is for AP Course 3, right? So you might have one comparison where there is a significant difference, another comparison where there is not a significant difference. And again, the ANOVA test by itself does not tell you which groups are significantly different. You have to run an additional test to tell you that. The two-way ANOVA has two independent variables with two or more levels. So using the similar examples from before, we are comparing mean scores across 3 classrooms. That's the first independent variable. But now we're curious about whether or not taking these exams before or after recess has any factor related to the mean scores, right? So we have two independent variables. It's the 3 classrooms and also before or after recess. And for our second example, again, we're comparing the mean time to complete homework for the 4 high school courses. So that's actually our independent variable number 1. And then we are also curious about whether students are in after school sports. That's our independent variable number 2. And you could do the sports variable in 2 different ways. One is they are in a sport, yes or no. So that would have 2 levels. Or you could do which sports they're actually in. So maybe it's basketball, soccer, and baseball. And that would be a 3-level independent variable. However you decide to measure it, that would still be a 2-way ANOVA because we have 2 different independent variables. And a two-way ANOVA provides you with the main effects and interaction effects. We'll talk a little bit more about this later on once we get into the actual calculations and formulas regarding these analyses. But in general, with a two-way ANOVA, you will have the main effect of how do 3 classrooms vary on their mean scores. And you will have another main effect of whether or not before and after recess affects the mean scores. And then there's the interaction effect. So in classroom 1, what's the difference between taking the test before or after recess? In classroom 2, what's the difference between taking the test before and after recess, right? So you might have that students within certain classrooms are more likely to do better based on the time at which they take their test. So that is just a real quick introduction to main effects and interaction effects for two-way ANOVA, but we'll get into that a little bit later as well. And then we have chi-square. So this is a significant test to compare frequencies or counts, right? Those n's that we've talked about before, in observed and expected scenarios. So before we were comparing means, right? Average test scores, average time to complete homework. Now we're doing counts. So you want to use this with categorical variables, right? Those variables that are non-numerical. A test score is a number, right? Gender is not a number. It's going to be a category. Same with race, ethnicity, and using our after-school sports example as well, right? Did you participate in after-school sports? Yes or no? Which sport did you participate in? All of those are non-numerical variables. So here we can use chi-square to answer the question, are there differences between the number of students, again, those frequencies, who participate in basketball, soccer, and track? And so what we're asking here is, do those numbers compare to, or are they significantly different from what we would expect if students participated in all 3 of these sports at the same rates, right? So do more students participate in basketball than soccer, or than soccer than track, or are they evenly spread out between all 3 of these? Another question that we can ask with the chi-square is, are there differences between genders and who participates in basketball, soccer, and track? Does one gender participate in any of these sports at higher rates than the other gender? Again, these are comparisons of counts or frequencies and not means. And so that's the most important thing to remember with the chi-square. I know this was a real brief introduction. Again, we are not getting into analyses or the formulas or calculations at this point. We will get into that a little bit more later on. So stay tuned for that in block 4. Otherwise, just think about when you might be using these different tests and think about whether or not they would be relevant for your dissertation.